Hello, Happy New Year, and welcome to another Hip Historian event featuring Marshall Shore. I am Brenda Holt with the Arizona State Office of AARP. We are the nation's largest nonprofit organization dedicated to empowering people 50 and older to choose how they live as they age. With a nationwide presence and nearly 38 million members across the nation and approximately 900,000 right here in Arizona, we work to strengthen our communities and we advocate for what matters most to families, such as health security, financial stability, and personal fulfillment. In the month of January, we will focus on the thriving job market. Despite the pre-pandemic unemployment levels, workers of all ages, but especially those 55 and older, are increasingly concerned about an uncertain and ever-changing job market. With high inflation, higher costs, and a possible recession have made older workers less confident in their ability to get a job or continue to grow in their careers. AARP is a wise friend and fierce defender of older workers and has programs, offerings, and resources to help. In an uncertain economy and rapidly changing market, you can count on AARP to help you navigate your job search and career path and fight back against age bias. We are also fighting to strengthen age discrimination laws, increase protections, and help companies across the country foster age-diverse workforces that value experience. Visit us at aarp.org/work for tips, tools, and resources to help stay competitive in the job market. Thank you again, and with that, I will turn it over to Marshall.
Ladies and gentlemen, non-binary folk, welcome to the show. Get ready to meet your host for the night, Arizona's very own hip historian himself, Marshall Shore.
Hello and good evening. I want to welcome you all to Arizona History Happy Hour. Oh my gosh, I am so happy you can be here tonight. We've got a really great show for you this evening. So just you wait and see what's all going to happen. Now, I know we've got folks on Facebook, YouTube. I know at least one friend out of New York is watching via LinkedIn. So happy you can all join us today. And so happy so many of you already found the chat session. It is great to see you all here. So Arizona History Happy Hour. So one thing I always like to do when I start off is that we start off with a little bit about what is today. So today being January 12th of 2023, that midway point between in January. So this date back in 1883, the Southern Pacific Railroad tracks were completed. A silver spike was hammered in the ground, and that meant that Tucson could now be reached from the East Coast by way of San Antonio. So those folks could take the train here to Tucson. And, you know, there are rumors about the train eventually coming back to Phoenix, which is kind of exciting. So we no longer have to go to Maricopa or Flagstaff to catch a train east or west. So excited about that possibility as well. So today is also National Kettlebell Day. You know, when I go to the gym, I see those things that resemble cannonballs. And they are used for fitness. Not by me, but I do see folks using them. So, you know, that kind of ties in the fact that today is Stick to Your New Year's Resolution Day. I mean, we're right in the middle of January. So many of you may have already given up on your resolutions. But, you know, maybe tonight you'll find renewed vim and vigor and be able to charge ahead and complete whatever resolutions you made. Now, it is also National Marzipan Day, which means, it's a day where we get to celebrate one of those amazing desserts that's really made primarily of sugar, but with a little bit of ground almond oil or extract. And so you find it a lot in, I think, Persian and also Italian cooking. I mean, the Italians love to make little fruit out of it. So, and model all kinds of things. So you can celebrate that today. As well, it is National Hot Tea Day. Tea has been in cups since about the 2nd century BC. Originating in China, it has grown in popularity to become the second most consumed beverage right after water. Now, this delicious blend of spices energizes, detoxifies, relaxes, and, gives us something to dip things in. So, whether you're having a milk tea or just a nice cup of hot tea, it's great weather all around the state for that right now. As well as it is also Kiss a Ginger Day. Now, this is something that you only find in about 2% of the population, although I bet there's a lot more redheads out there than just 2% of the population. But, sadly, kiss a ginger now while you can, because it is a recessive gene that is slowly fading away. At least natural redheads are slowly fading away. But they are still around, and a little bottle can always revive that intensity of your hair. So there you go for January 12th. So what can you expect for Arizona? Indeed, you are, Jason. So what can you expect on this episode of Arizona History Happy Hour? Well, we've got a little bit of trivia coming up. Anna, go ahead and kiss your ginger cat. So we've got a little bit of trivia coming up, as well as Little Arizona, talking about a small town in Arizona. We have a little bit of Arizona music history, as well as From the Vault, which is always just kind of a little something about Arizona that you might not know, but drive by a lot. We also do indeed have a beverage, as well as a special guest. So now, if this is your first time watching, you might wonder, who is that man and why is he on my screen? Well, my name is Marshall Shore, and I got to Arizona over 23 years ago. I was working in Brooklyn at a little Carnegie, well, not a little Carnegie, but a big Carnegie library. And so decided to trade that beautiful building, plus that snow, that slush, all that weather. Decided that it was time to move to someplace sunny and relocated to a library in South Phoenix, where there was a rich oral tradition of the community. And that's one of the things that got me looking at Arizona through just storytelling. And so that's how I got to where I am today. Now, we promptly moved to Arizona and moved into a beautiful 1956 ranch. Now, when we got here, it was oh so many tones of beige. Well, hello, Veronica. Thank you for coming all the way. And did you bring any hot cakes to share? So, we promptly moved to Arizona and moved into a beautiful 1956 ranch that is pretty much a time capsule. I'll show you what I mean, because right there is my kitchen. That's what it looks like today. All that buttercream yellow tile. That matching yellow in the wall oven, which works like a charm, as well as the matching stovetop. And so that's, and pretty much those are the original cabinets, original pulls. So indeed, our house, some friends call it the unmuseum, because everything is touchable, and we indeed love to bring in more and more history. Now, as soon as we got to Arizona, all we heard was there was no history here. But I knew that wasn't true quickly on, because, when every time I would go somewhere, whether it was on foot, on a bike, in a car, on a bus, it didn't matter. But I kept running across so many amazing people, places, and stories. And so that's just what we're going to do tonight is we're going to talk about some stories. But first, I'm also known as the hip historian. Now, you might wonder why. Actually, later this month, I'm going to be doing a project or a program with Equality Arizona at the Tempe Library. So that's going to be fun, as well as then later in January, talking about LGBTQ history at Agua Caliente Park down in Tucson. As well as then I'm also going to be out in Apache Junction talking about another one of my passions, vintage signs and our neon. So that's going to be a lot of fun. As well as the Willow Home Tour is coming up in mid-February on the 19th. The night before, we're actually going to be doing a VIP tour of Willow. And so if people sign up for the Twilight Tour that they do in advance, there will be an option that comes through to upgrade to that trolley tour that we're going to be doing around Willow. As well as then in February also, we are going to be doing Hats and High Tea at the Pioneer and Military Memorial Park. That is a fundraiser for preservation of headstones. So, this will be the first time we've done it. And gosh, I think 3, maybe even 4 years. It's been a while. So looking forward to doing that again. As well as we have Arizona Unzipped coming up on March 24th, which is going to be basically a educational burlesque show. I will tell stories about Arizona, and Pyra and her dancers and musicians, including a full orchestra, including a live orchestra, not a full orchestra, but a live orchestra, will be just sharing history and lots of Arizona love. Now you can also, I've started putting up Arizona History Happy Hour up on Spotify, so you can also listen to it as a podcast. Well, and I see so many of you have found the chat, but in case, say you have somebody you think would be a really good guest on Happy Hour, you can reach out to me either on Facebook, Instagram, email, or through my website. And the key word in all of that is hip historian. All right. Now, it would not be Happy Hour without a beverage. And, tonight is no different. So PJ decided that we should do something because, our theme tonight is a little bit of Wild West. Oh, let's see. And so Silent Bob, my bartender, so he is making... It is a take on the Old West pink, or a Wild West take on the Pink Lady. So it's got a little bit of Sentinel Mesquite rye from Tucson. Now PJ puts them in these little jars, so I don't have to do any mixing. All I have to do is just pour like that, and I get a delicious cocktail. And so let's see. And so tonight's cocktail is called Calamitous Calvados. So it's got a little bit from Tucson. We've got some rye. We've got a little bit from Sedona, some dry gin, as well as lemon juice, grenadine. Oh, and PJ, I already know that that's going to wind up on a menu somewhere. So looking forward to that. So, all right. So here we are for Little Arizona. So, that's one of the beauties, I think, of Arizona is... Oh, let's see. No. Hello, Jana.
Here I am. Oh, my God. I am so sorry.
No worries at all. So, okay, so I've got you on speaker. We're just getting ready to do a Little Arizona, and then we will launch into some trivia.
Okay, you got it.
All right. So tonight for Little Arizona, we are talking about a town called Moccasin, Arizona.
Where, Arizona?
Moccasin.
Moccasin. Okay.
So Moccasin, Arizona. So Moccasin is in the northern part of the state. And so it has a rich American Indian history, early explorers, as well as Mormon pioneer. Now, the water of the pipe springs made it possible for the plants, the animals, to really live in this dry desert region. It had lots of indigenous folks hanging out there. And then about 1850s, you wind up with Latter-day Saint missionary expeditions coming in. Now it has a population of about 94. And so you can see it's quite beautiful up in there. And so one of the so there is the big house, which was built in 1875 and was really about the Mormon pioneer craftsmen building this house. And so many folks along the Arizona Trail or the Honeymoon Trail stayed in this house. So it is now in the middle of the Kaibab forest, but you can still go visit Moccasin, Arizona.
So it's called the Honeymoon Trail because the Mormons who were coming were on their honeymoons, right?
Indeed, yes, yes.
Wow.
Yeah, so it's just south of that northern border, just south of Utah. So,
cool.
Indeed.
Very good.
All right. So, Jana, I am so happy you can join us this evening.
I am too, and I'm so sorry that I screwed up earlier, but I promise to be totally on your focus right now.
Very good. Well, happy you are here.
Thank you.
So, let's see. So, okay, Jana, for folks that don't know you, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm a longtime Arizona journalist. I came here in 1972 out of graduate school from the University of Michigan and worked for the Arizona Republic, and I worked for the New Times, and I worked for Phoenix Magazine, and I worked for Channel 3, then I worked for Channel 8, and I now write for True West Magazine. So I have really been around the whole valley kind of thing, working with a variety of, I wrote for Arizona Highways. So I've really been here a long time and covered Arizona a long time, but mainly I covered contemporary Arizona until I went to work for Bob Bell at True West Magazine, where I started covering historical Arizona. And that's when my eyes were really open to what this state was all about and what the West was all about. And it has been an absolutely joyous exploration of that history, which is so rich and so wonderfully convoluted, as you well know. It's not hard to get sucked into this mania over the Western history because there's just so many characters and so many people that are magnificent. And I've focused on the women of the West because most of history has decided to ignore women, which, as you know. And so I've been exploring all these different magnificent women who really helped make the West what it is today. And Bob Bell and I have just published a book about that called Hellraisers and Trailblazers, The Real Women of the Wild West, which was a delight to explore some of these phenomenal women. So that's what I do.
Very cool. So I mean, it's like, I mean, you've got quite a history of yourself, but tonight we're talking about other women's history. And so now trivia here at Happy Hour is a little bit differently than if you go to bar trivia.
Mm-hmm.
So what happens here is we're going to go through the questions, the possible answers, because they're all multiple choice.
Okay.
We'll take a quick Arizona music break, talking about some Arizona music history, and then come back and we will talk about all those amazing answers and all those amazing women.
Good.
All right. So let's get started with our very first question. And it is, who is the most celebrated American woman? Would it be A, Harriet Tubman, B, Eleanor Roosevelt, C, Sacagawea, or D, Susan B. Anthony? So it is one of those women who is the
All
most
good
celebrated.
candidates, all very, very good candidates.
They are indeed very good candidates. So it'll be tough to choose which one. So, all right, question 2. Who is considered to be the mother of women's Western migration? A, Eliza Spalding. B, Calamity Jane. C, Narcissa Whitman. Or D, Agnes Locke Hickok. So one of those women is considered to be the mother of women's Western migration. All right, question 3. Who was the Apache Joan of Arc? Was it A, Lozin, B, Sarah Winnemucca, C, Delici, or D, Susan LaFlèche? So who do you think is the Apache Joan of Arc? All right. Question 4. Who was Chinatown's vengeful angel? A, Helen Hunt Jackson. B, Donalinda Cameron. C, Tai Leong. Or D, Clara Flotz. All right. So Chinatown's vengeful angel, who was it? All right, and here we have that halfway point. And why are women decried as hyenas in petticoats? Is it because A, they wanted birth control? B, they wanted freer divorce laws? C, they wanted to vote? Or D, they wanted equal pay? I think all 4 of those are good candidates of things. So, all right. So question 6. Who said, I'm a bulldog running along the feet of Jesus, barking at what he doesn't like? Was that A, Mary Jane Coulter, B, Carrie Nation, C, Annie Oakley, or D, Maddie Earp?
This is one of my favorite questions. I love it. Imagine the ego you had to have to make that statement. Imagine the ego. Oh my God.
know. It's like right up there with the Beatles.
Yeah, exactly.
So indeed, you had to have a huge ego to be able to say that. So,
Yeah.
But I have a feeling some of those women, probably all of those women had big egos.
I think so. I think they did.
So, all right. So question 7. Who is the poet writer accredited with saving Arizona's statehood? Is it A, Martha Summer Hayes, B, Belle Starr, C, Charlotte Hall, or D, Maddie Silks? So which one of those was a poet, writer, and is credited with saving Arizona's statehood? That's going to be a good story. I can already tell. All right, question 8. What Old West female journalist got a cannibal out of prison? What? All right. Okay. So I'm not even quite sure what that question means, but okay. Was that A, Nellie Bly? Was it B, Polly Pry? C, Laura Nihill? Or D, Ida Tarbell? All right. So one of those women were journalists, and they also got a cannibal out of prison. Shocking.
Shocking.
Indeed. All right. Question 9. Who was the great Westerner? Was it A, Sarah Bowman, B, Olive Mother Ryther, C, Gertrudis Barcelo, or D, Nellie Cashman? All right. So which one of those women is known as the Great Westerner?
It's actually the Great Western, I think.
Oh, is it the Great Western? Oh,
yeah,
all
the
right.
Great Western. Yeah, yeah. She was called the Great Western.
All right. And here we are at our last and final question. What is the claim to fame of the West Rodeo Queens? A, were they the first women to wear pants in public? Shock. B, were they the best paid women in the country? Ooh. C, were they the first professional female athletes in North America? Maybe. They outrode the male performers. Oh my gosh. All right, so what was the claim to fame of Western rodeo queens? All right. So while you are getting your answers ready, locking in those final votes, we are going to take a quick Arizona music break. And, and I thought since we were talking about women of the West, it would be a great time to talk about Billy Maxwell. Now, Billy Maxwell grew up in Nutrioso, which is over near Springerville. And she was on a ranch family, but her father started a music group called the White Mountain Orchestra. And so they would perform around town at dances and all kinds of celebrations. And she was a guitarist and vocalist. But then in the late 20s, an engineer came traveling through. He was basically a talent scout looking for people to record with Victor Talking Machine Company. And so her family was invited to El Paso. And so she became known as the cowgirl singer.
Oh my gosh.
And so what I love is that her songs back in the late 20s, I mean, they really spoke to the struggles of poor women. So you can track some of her recordings down on YouTube. There's also a really good display over at the MIM. So if you get a chance, swing by and take a look. And so she is the first woman in Arizona to record Western music. So Billy Maxwell, there you go. All right. And I'm sure people are ready for some answers. All right.
Okay.
So who is the most celebrated American woman? And C, Sacagawea.
Isn't this amazing? She was a 16-year-old Shoshone girl. She had been stolen from her tribe in Idaho and taken to Dakota Territory, where she was married off to a French fur trapper. Either he won her in a poker game or he bought her. She was his third or fourth wife. She was pregnant, and into camp comes in 1802 these explorers called Lewis and Clark. And they were on the expedition to go across the United States in the brand new territory that Jefferson had just bought for $50 million from Napoleon. And they were to find a waterway that would go all the way across the country. So they were absolutely certain. See, this was an area that wasn't even mapped yet. I mean, this was just the wild, they call this the Great American Desert. This whole area from Mississippi to the west, they considered that all one big desert, which is how far off they were on everything, right? And but they were sure that there must be a waterway where they could take a boat all the way to the Pacific to the Atlantic, or from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Well, of course, there was none. And that would be the big discovery. But that was what they were trying to find. And her husband was hired to be the interpreter and to work on this, to go from North Dakota all the way to the Pacific. And she came carrying her brand new baby with her. And she twice saved this entire expedition from ruin. Without her, the 2-year expedition would have been over in 37 days. Because she once saved all their equipment, all their maps, all their papers, all their equipment, which was about to be washed down the river. But she calmly gathered it all together as the boat was sinking and saved that. And then later she saved them all from death when they were trying to negotiate with a tribe, which turns out to be her old tribe, where her brother was now the chief. And there was a thought about killing these people because they were like, a nuisance. And she convinced them not to do that. And in fact, to give them horses so they could continue on. And so she was really responsible largely for the success of that entire expedition. There are more statues, more commendations, stamps, money, all kinds of statues all over the place. A place named for her than any other single American woman of any color. Now, isn't that astonishing?
Wow, that is incredible. Well, and
But
and that was the thing. I mean, there were so many statues ranging from much larger than life to life
mhm.
size and kind of everything in between.
Right, right. I mean, she really is. She's really loved and admired, by everyone, including North Dakota. One of North Dakota's statues in the Statuary Hall in the state capitol. Every state gets two statues of citizens that they think honor them. She's one of North Dakota's two statues in the Statuary Hall. So North Dakota is very, and I'm a North Dakota girl. So I really feel a kinship with this woman because we both gave him sort of the same area. But yeah, she was a remarkable woman, an absolutely remarkable woman. The strength of a 16-year-old teenager carrying a baby on her back halfway across the country and doing what she did was pretty wonderful.
Wow, indeed. All right, question 2. Who is considered to be the mother of women's Western migration?
And the answer is Narcissa Whitman. But I have issue with this answer because although that's the correct answer, Eliza Spaulding, who had come west with Narcissa, both of their families, they were both newlyweds, and they both came as preachers and as missionaries to minister to the Western tribes. Narcissa would go up into the Walla Walla area. And in fact, the Whitman College is named for her. And she would prove herself to be someone who couldn't stand Indians. I mean, she'd come to minister to the Indians, but she didn't like Indians, and she didn't warm to them, and she treated them badly. And they saw her as someone who disdained them. Eventually, they murdered her and her husband. And it was a horrible thing. But Eliza, on the other hand, she was over more in the Idaho area. And she was she was the first white woman to learn the language. She loved the people she was ministering to. She was had the true heart of a missionary spirit. And she was kept safe when this kind of war started with the missionaries. So she doesn't get any credit, where I think she deserves a lot more credit. But because Narcissa was murdered, she gets the big honor, right? But I also look at this, and I because I don't know that she was murdered, but I also look on this as like, she wasn't even kind to these people. She couldn't even stand these people. And Eliza, on the other hand, loved these people. And so I get torn. But Narcissa Whitman gets the official nod.
Well, and sometimes that happened. I mean, as you look, there's also like the same issue with like Mary Coulter. It's like, did she do all the things that are attributed to her, or did other folks working for her do it?
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
And in some cases we'll never know the truth because they're long gone. We can't ask.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. So question 3. Who was the Apache Joan of Arc?
Well, that was Lozin, and that's an Arizona girl. She's an Arizona Apache. She was the sister of Victorio, who was one of the great chiefs. She ran with Geronimo in the very last band of free Apaches in the world. She was one of them. She was a healer. She was I think a kind of a mystic. She was a midwife. She was an official warrior. Apache girls were taught, just like the boys, how to ride, how to shoot, how to trap, how to, everything. But then the girls were expected to go and get married and take care of the children and the family and all that. Well, Lozin said, I'm never going to marry, and I want to be a real warrior. And the chiefs allowed her, the only girl ever, to be allowed to be a real warrior. and so she was always with her brother, except when he was killed. And they always have thought that if she'd have just been with him rather than taking a pregnant woman back to the reservation, that in fact she would have detected that bad people were coming, and she would have saved her brother. But she wasn't there to save him. So, but when Geronimo went into exile in 1886, she was one of the Indians that went with him first to Florida, where of course it was disastrous because it was, the weather and the whole atmosphere was horrible, and a whole bunch of people died right away. And then she eventually was sent to Oklahoma, where she eventually would die. But she was she's considered by some to be the greatest guerrilla fighter in American history.
Wow.
Yeah, and she's quite an interesting woman. I just had a talk the other day with somebody whose wife's horse is named Lozen, which I thought was pretty wonderful. If I had a horse, I'd name her Lozen.
All right. Question 4. Who was Chinatown's vengeful angel?
Oh my, this is a magnificent story. This is Donaldina Cameroon. She was this tall, prim, proper Presbyterian girl who was talked into coming to San Francisco to help out a friend who was sick. And that friend had opened up a house to help the Chinese girls who were being suckered into coming over here, thinking they were coming to marry nice Chinese men, but instead were being sold into slavery or turned into prostitutes. And the friend, Donaldina's friend, eventually died not long after she got here. And so she was left with sort of being charged with helping, and she made it into an art form. She would go into Chinatown and break down the doors and steal the girls and grab the girls and flee, literally run through the streets to take them to safety to their house. Then the cops would show up, often with the Chinese men who owned, quote unquote, owned these girls, who would claim that, well, this is my niece. I mean, she kidnapped my niece, right? And so Donaldina knew that they had to start getting laws to help start protecting these girls and protecting all girls who are in these situations. And she went to the church, and the church said, "Oh, little lady, you go home and you take, never mind, we'll take care of it." And she thought, they're not going to take care of it, so she took care of it. So the first child, she was responsible for the first child labor laws, and it said that she saved some 3,000 Chinese girls. And she brought the girls in, she educated them. The first Chinese girl to go to college came out of her house. The first Chinese woman who was an official interpreter hired by the federal government and had a civil service job came out of her house. So she did this remarkable work for the Chinese girls. To this day, Cameron House still exists in San Francisco. The phone is still answered in Chinese, and it is still a house for refuge. But now it is a refuge for someone of any nationality.
Well, I love how so many of the women we've been talking about have been educators and really supporting women and getting them to just better themselves and to move and to get out of, talk about a horrible situation. Going to a new city
It's a new country.
Yeah.
Yeah, a whole new country. These guys would go over to China and say to their parents, "Oh my God, there are all these wonderful young men." And there were a lot of Chinese men had come to America first to build the railroad, first looking for gold, then to build the railroad, then all this stuff, right?
Right.
So there was a lot of opportunity, and the thought that their children could be advanced and would have this fabulous life. So the poor families never knew the difference. And these men were just conning them, and it was horrible. It was just horrible. But I think she's one of the bravest women I've ever known about. And you've never even heard her name before. Probably.
No, that was the thing. It's like until this, I had never heard the name before. So then I started researching, and I was like, oh my gosh.
I know. And isn't she remarkable?
Yeah. And at that time, to be so strong-willed.
I know, exactly. This was started in the late 1800s, like 1890s or something, is the kind of when she really started in. And yeah, and she was never prepared for this kind of work. I mean, she was a straight lace. You look at her and she looked like a straight laced, a Presbyterian lady who should be home, with her children, or else home taking care of her mom and dad. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And here she is in a very, very dangerous work. They wanted to kill her. They wanted to get rid of her because she was such a danger to everybody. But she was so brave. I just love her. I just love her.
Wow. What an amazing story. All right. So question 5, why were women decried as hyenas in petticoats?
Because they wanted the vote. When the suffragettes were, first of all, the word suffragette was meant as a blasphemy, as a put down. Oh, these are suffragettes. And so the suffragettes said, well, you know what? You can't get us with your words. We'll adopt that word as our own. And so they took the word on their own, right? And then the guys called them hyenas in petticoats. And the fight for the vote went on it started in 1848, really, at Seneca Falls. And then it wasn't until 1920 that the United States, as a country, gave women, white women, let me make that distinction, white women the right to vote. But I'll tell you, in the Western United States, all the Western states were voting long before 1920. Arizona was one of the last, and that was in 1912. So then it started in 1869 in Wyoming. So the 4,000 women in the West were voting for decades before Eastern women ever were able to vote for the first time in their lives. The West sent a woman to Congress before Eastern women could vote. We sent Janet Rankin from Wyoming, who was a Republican woman from Wyoming. We sent her to Congress before Eastern women could even vote. Imagine that. So I'm very, very proud of what the West did for women voting. I mean, people say, well, why do you suppose they did it this way? I said, I think it's because women stood shoulder to shoulder with the men in building the West. And in fact, one of the slogans in Arizona was, remember, women were as anxious as the men worried as anxiously as the men over Arizona. So they stood shoulder to shoulder with them, and when it went to a popular vote, and in Arizona it had to go to a popular vote, the legislature kept turning them down. The legislature in Arizona in the territorial days kicked women in the teeth 6 times. 6 times they were almost on the verge of having the vote, and they were kicked in the teeth. Finally, the first vote after statehood, the proposition on the ballot put there because the women finally took things in their own hands was, can women have the right to vote? And the men in Arizona overwhelmingly voted for women's suffrage. 62% of the fabulous men of Arizona voted for women to have the vote. It's the highest percentage of vote ever registered for suffrage in the nation. And so the men were saying, you damn right, these women have a right to vote. Look what they've done. Look at how they've stood with everybody. They have not shirked one responsibility. They have helped build the West and build Arizona. Sure, they deserve the vote. So they tried to make fun of them by calling them hyenas in petticoats and doing cartoons. Some of the cartoons that they had back in those days are just hysterical. Deriding women and making fun of them and poking, and making them look foolish and acting, all uppity about the whole thing. But when people had the chance to vote, they voted to give women the vote, and this happens state after state after state in the West.
Wow.
And then finally, in 1920, of course, the Susan B. Anthony Amendment was passed, and suffrage was expanded to primarily the white women. Black women had to fight for, because the Black women supposedly could vote, except that there were all the things that they had done to keep Black men from voting, all the tricks that they used. Well, they used the same tricks on the women, right? The women got around it faster, and Indian women weren't even allowed to vote until like 1948 in Arizona. which is 28 years later.
Wow.
So Native women really were the ones that suffered the most. They didn't have the chance to have their voice heard for a long time.
Wow, that's amazing. All right, so question 6. Who said, "I am a bulldog running along the feet of Jesus, barking at what he doesn't like"?
That was Carrie A. Nation, who named herself Carrie A. Nation because she thought that it was her role to carry a nation into prohibition. Get it?
Indeed.
So she changed her name around. So she was the woman who took the axe. They called her the battle axe. You know, and she took an axe to saloons. She broke up saloons. Ice of yourself, and she'd start breaking up bottles of whiskey and stuff. She was determined that liquor was the crux of all the domestic problems, and in fact, the whole prohibition thing, a lot of it was because there was so much violence in families because men came home drunk and beat up their families and stuff. And squandered their paychecks by, drinking in the saloon instead of coming home and paying the bills. And so, one of the very, first big domestic violence fights was to get rid of alcohol. Well, this is the woman who led the fight. And for a while, she was like really, really like popular. But then she just kept, she wouldn't listen to anybody else. She just had her own way of doing it. And as you can tell from that quote, she had an ego that was bigger than the state of Montana. You know what I'm saying?
Well, and also choosing to change her name to Carrie A. Nation.
Right. I mean, she had, she had, oh my God. So eventually, like the suffragettes and everybody, especially women in the West, because the first institution in the West were the saloons. When women migrated out here, whether they were black or white women who migrated out, we already had Native and Mexican women here, and then the other women came out. When they came out here, what they found was basically the only institution was the saloon, and so that's where, in fact, men voted in those days, and women weren't allowed to go into saloons. Decent women were not allowed to go into saloons. You would not find a decent, good woman walking into a saloon for any reason whatsoever. It was like poison, right? So that was one of the other ways that they tried to keep women away from the polling place by putting the polling place in a place that women wouldn't go, right? But they also were very aware that not every man was a drunkard. I mean, some men just enjoyed a drink or two. They enjoyed the camaraderie. This was a chance for them to have the meal with their friends, to play cards. You know what I mean? It was a social gathering as well as a saloon. And so the Western women were far less interested in prohibition than were the Eastern women, because Western women knew it was going to be their downfall, that the men of the West would go, wait a minute, you're after our, we can't even have a drink with our buddies now, So there was a real split in that. And Carrie Nation was really felt that split. And eventually they just wanted, and her campaign was focused in Kansas, where she lived, which was supposed to be a dry state. Kansas was the first state in the nation that came into the nation as a dry state. This constitution said you cannot have a saloon, but nobody paid any attention to that. I mean, there were saloons all over the place. And so she was saying, I'm going to uphold the law. But yeah, her ego was pretty amazing. Pretty amazing.
Well, and even here we had so many speakeasies.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. In Arizona. Oh, God, yeah.
Oh, indeed. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. The only place that was ever dry, the only place that was ever dry in Arizona was when they built Roosevelt Dam, and they had that encampment out there.
Oh.
You probably know the name. I can't remember the name.
I do. Yes. Actually, I just talked about that a couple weeks ago, and I don't remember what the name is, but yes.
Yes, that encampment was dry. It was the only dry spot in the entire state of Arizona. That's funny. I know.
That is hilarious. All right. Question 7. Who is the poet writer credited with saving Arizona's statehood?
Now, some people should know this. I mean, some of your audience indeed should know that this is Charlotte Hall, who is not just a museum up in Prescott, but of course was a real woman, a real poet, a real writer, a real strong suffragette, a real great strong woman, was the first historian for the state of Arizona, was the first woman in the country to hold a government job, being a historian. And who, in fact, was absolutely adamant about how important it was for Arizona to get statehood. You know, if I could live at any time in Arizona history, it would be at that last time, at that last part, like maybe say from 1908 maybe to 1912, because in 1912 we got statehood, right? But in those last 4 or 5 years of the frenzy, Arizona had been trying for 50 years to become a state, and Washington didn't want us. Nobody wanted us, you know. Somebody said that we were just a place that had too many scorpions, too many Democrats, and too many Mexicans. I mean, they found all kinds of reasons not to like us. But when they came out here to look us over, we showed them, you know, that we weren't very educated, we weren't very sophisticated, we weren't very cultured. There were, you know, I mean, we lived up to their expectations. I'm going to tell you that. So, so there was an effort in 1902 when Teddy Roosevelt, dear old Teddy, was the president, to join Arizona and New Mexico together into one state, with Santa Fe being the capital. Because they thought, well, let's throw all these Mexicans and all these Indians and all these, you know, all this desert land, let's throw all this stuff together. You know, and we only have to deal with one state like that, not two. I mean, that's ridiculous. And so they went to a public vote. Well, New Mexico said, yeah, that sounds great to us. Well, of course, they were the ones who were going to end up being the state, right? Arizona overwhelmingly said, are you kidding me? So in the midst of all of this, Charlotte Hall writes a very impassioned poem called Arizona, in which she just is seething in every sentence to tell Washington, go to hell, basically, you know what I mean? But she says it eloquently and saying, you know, we're not bowing to any state. We don't have any reason to become the second best to anybody. We are a wonderful, glorious place, all of our own. Da, 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 da. Well, the poem was so powerful that Dwight Hurd, who then owned the newspaper in town and whose home is now the Hurd Museum, he reprinted that poem and put it on every desk in Congress. And Eastern papers credited that poem with changing a lot of minds, and said Arizona owes Charlotte Hall a great big thing of gratitude.
Wow. And, you know, I mean, and I love the fact that poetry saved Arizona statehood.
I know. Isn't that something?
That's amazing. You know, I wonder if Rosemarie Dombrowski, the Phoenix Poet Laureate, knows that. I hope so. I'm gonna send her a note later tonight and just remind her in case she had forgotten.
Great. And I have the poem if you need the poem.
Oh, cool. Okay, I will let you know if she wants a copy.
If I was at my desk, I could be reciting to you, because it's a wonderful poem. It's a very long poem. It's many stanzas, but it touts Arizona, the quality of Arizona. So Charlotte Hall was a woman to be reckoned with. I mean, she was a forceful, wonderful woman, and she wouldn't let anybody get her. Here, I have one great story about her afterwards. So, and she was a Republican, right? A Republican woman from Prescott. And several years later, she was seen on the streets of Prescott talking to this Democratic woman who had been a friend of hers for 25 years, right? She gets a visit that afternoon from somebody from the Republican Party who says, Charlotte, you can't be seen on the street talking to a Democrat. And she said, why? And he says, well, it looks like you're endorsing her. I mean, you gotta just stick with your own here. She said, are you kidding me? She says, that woman has as much interest and love for Prescott as I do. She said, we just happen to differ on some policies, but you can't tell me what to do. And so, I mean, I just loved that story. To me, says something so true about her. that she was her very, very own person, and wouldn't let anybody tell her what to do, no matter who they were.
Right. And, and that history that we have of working across aisles.
Yes.
I mean, we've got so many famous women who have done that exact same thing.
Right. Right. I mean, the women who gave us suffrage in Arizona were from every political bent: Republican, Independent, Mormon women. Oh my God, Mormon women were so vital to that effort. And Democratic women. I mean, they were everybody, and they were all working together on the same cause. I mean, it was really one of the great cross-cultural things that had ever happened in Arizona. Was that I love that about our suffrage movement.
Indeed. All right, question 8. What Old West female journalist got a cannibal out of prison?
This is Polly Pry. Isn't that a great name, Polly Pry?
Yeah.
And this is, I know. It's like this, like you pry into everything, and Polly. This is a woman that I just was introduced to. This is a woman that I knew nothing about. Now, a lot of other people know a lot about Polly Pry. I just had never heard of her. I'd never heard of this situation. And when I discovered her for myself, I went kind of nuts. So I'm reading her biography, and I'm reading about her biography. The biography of her. So Polly Pry was the first woman to be hired by the Denver newspapers. So she was Colorado's first female journalist. And female journalism back in the late 1800s was something pretty amazing. I mean, we had some pretty phenomenal journalists right here in Arizona, women journalists in Arizona. Well, Polly kind of outdid everybody. So she was fearless. She heard the story of Alfred Parker. Let me say, right, I'm saying that wrong. Alfred Parker. His name is Parker, I guess. Yes, he was a guy who had he had been out in the mountains in the wintertime with a group, and he was supposed to be leading this group. He didn't know what he was doing, and they all get lost, and they basically were starving to death, and they died. And then to stay alive, he ate some of them. So when he gets back into town, they go back and they find the bodies in the spring, and they decide that the guys had been murdered, not just died by themselves. And so they charge him with murder and with cannibalism. And of course, they send him to prison. And he's been in prison for 25 years by the time Polly Pry comes along. So she goes in and she starts interviewing him. And he's never been interviewed before. I mean, no one ever was cared to talk to him, So he says to her, I never murdered anybody. He said, I had to eat those guys or I was going to die, but I never murdered anybody. And she said, on the high seas, if you are stranded on the high seas and somebody dies and you have no food, you are allowed to eat that person. I mean, that's a rule of the sea. Did you know that? I didn't know that.
That's more reason not to go on sea. No cruises for me.
Right. Well, she said, well, why doesn't that apply if you're in the middle of the mountains of Montana or Colorado?
Right.
She said, that should apply the same thing. It was a survivalist thing. So she starts in on this drumbeat of writing these stories about Alfred Parker and how he should be. He served enough time. He served 25 years. And the drumbeat gets so loud. I mean, the governor is absolutely aghast. It's like, what are you talking about? I mean, it's like, this was like one of the most famous cases in Colorado history. And here she's now saying, you guys send an innocent man to prison, right? And they're all thinking that this is the biggest, stain on our entire history, right? Well, she gets the public so riled up that they demand the governor give him a pardon, and he does. So Alfred Parker comes out of prison and ends up living in Littleton, Colorado, and becomes a vegetarian.
I don't blame him at all.
I don't either.
Oh my gosh.
Just lives out his life, a little quiet man.
Wow, that's incredible.
She was absolutely, this woman was, she talk about some. But I think power went to her head. I mean, but it did it in kind of a good way, you know. I mean, I really like sassy women, as you can probably tell. But I mean, I really like women that really have a sense of who they are and what they can do and use their power. And she was one of those kinds of women. She hated. Oh, listen to this. You love this. She hated Molly Brown, you know, from the Titanic.
Oh, indeed, yeah.
Yeah, she had her own paper for a while after she left the Denver Post. And she had her own newspaper, and she would rail against Molly Brown because Molly Brown was one of these nouveau rich, was like a poor girl who got rich because her husband found oil or gold or something, right?
Right.
And she found her to be uncouth. You know, she didn't think she belonged. She didn't have any class. That's what Polly thought. And so they fought all the time and she always was bad-mouthing Molly Brown. And here Molly Brown was this big hero of Colorado. And so that would have been a fun thing to sit and watch that happen, you know?
Well, and I'm shocked there's been no movie about this.
I know. Shouldn't there be a movie about this? There should be a movie about this. There really should be.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, as you're saying this, I'm like, oh my gosh, this is right for a movie.
I know. You're right. You're absolutely right.
Well, and I want to give a shout out to Anita, who actually did share the poem Arizona. She shared a link for it. They can go to a website on Poetry Nook and find that poem. So thank you, Anita, for chiming in with that.
Oh, good. I'm so glad. That's great. Okay, good.
All right. So who was known as the Great Western?
The Great Western. And well, first I got to tell you what this name is. His name is not a thing that says this is a great person of the West. The Great Western was the largest ship on the ocean. And this woman, whose name was Sarah Bowman, was a large, like 6 foot tall, 250 pounds, a big sturdy woman. And she was kind of a giant compared to most of the men around her. And so they named her after that ship.
Oh.
So she is famous for saying that she had the biggest leg in Mexico, right? Now, Bob Bosbell, my partner in this book, thinks that that's the funniest line he's ever heard. Well, you know, and she did say it. You know, she said, you know, and so at first I just sort of discounted her as like, oh God, you know. Well, then as we're researching this book, I start studying her and finding books about her and stuff on the internet and everything. My God, she was an absolutely remarkable, phenomenal woman. I mean, she's a cook. She's a hotel person. She's probably a part-time prostitute every now and then. She adopts children. She is a nurse. She's a doctor. She's a big Catholic. She gets involved with the Olive Oatman story, you know, the captive girl. Oh, yeah. I discovered that there's an incredible connection between her and Olive Oatman that has been hidden in history on purpose because they didn't want anyone to know. Anyway, you'll have to read my book.
Exactly. More reason to buy that book and find out what is the connection.
Unbelievable connection. And she was just this really bizarrely wonderful, strong woman who did things her very own way. I mean, and she didn't take any gruff from anybody. And she always was demanded that she be treated like a proper lady, which she always was. And she wouldn't allow like gruff discussion around, you know, like gruff talk and stuff, or, you know, lots of swearing and all that kind of stuff. She always made sure that every place was clean and everything was very nice. And she, you know, I mean, she ended up at Yuma, at Yuma.
Yeah.
When there was a fort at Yuma, which had to be the ugliest fort in the world, because Yuma, you can imagine what Yuma was like in those days. And she was buried in Yuma. And then when the fort, of course, went away, and they moved all the military bodies from Fort Yuma to the Presidio in San Francisco, they moved her. Her coffin was by far the biggest coffin they moved, and she was the first woman put in the Presidio.
Wow.
Yeah. And someone said that if they hadn't had this thing about whether she'd been a prostitute or not, which was never clear, But, and here's where I come down on this thing. When men are being bested, then they usually say, oh, yeah, she's just a whore. You know what I'm saying? I mean,
Right.
it's an old, tired, stupid, a slander against women. So half the time when they're saying, oh, she's just a whore, she probably wasn't even a whore at all. She wasn't probably a prostitute at all. But she had hotels and stuff, and she might have been. Maybe she did. I don't know. I hardly care. And in fact, several historians said, who cares?
Well, right.
That's not what she's important for. But someone said that if she hadn't had that over her head as a possibility, she would have been known as the greatest civilian woman soldier in America, because she was so involved in the Mexican War. On our side, she was helping out the troops and traveling with the troops and helping people and stuff. So she was a pretty phenomenal woman.
Wow, that's amazing. And yet another name I've never heard of.
Yeah. No, you'll love her. Once you'll get into her, Marshall. You'll just adore her.
It sounds like it. Oh my God.
She's our kind of woman. She's our kind of woman.
Exactly. All right. And our last question is, what is the claim to fame of West's rodeo queens?
Well, actually, every single one of those answers could be the answer. The official answer is that they are the first professional female athletes in North America. But they also were the first women to wear pants in public. They also were the highest paid women in America. And what was the fourth thing I said in that list? They did. And they
outshot.
oftentimes were better ropers and bronc riders and trick riders than the men. So they held their own. I mean, they were really phenomenal. These women were. That's probably who I wish I could have been. Would have been a rodeo girl. A rodeo woman, I guess, a rodeo queen. I don't want to have been a queen. They traveled the country and they held their families together and most of them married cowboys. Not always very successfully, but they tried. But they stuck together. In Fort Worth at the National Cowgirl Hall of Fame, they have magnificent displays about a lot of these women, and there were a whole bunch of them. I mean, I can't tell you the number of rodeo women there were, but I'm going to bet you that it was around 100, maybe, because there were tons of women. There were dozens, at least dozens and dozens.
Right.
And they were very spunky and they were very wonderful. So they were officially the first professional women athletes. So the West gave to America and to the continent women athletes. We gave them the first women politicians. We gave them women voting. Eventually we would give them the first Supreme Court justice in our own Arizona, Sandra Day O'Connor. We gave them the first female Speaker of the House in Nancy Pelosi. We have one thing after another where Western women have been at the forefront of American life.
Wow. Go Arizona.
Go Arizona, I know, and go West. And go West, young lady, go West.
Exactly. Not just go West, young man, but go West, young lady. Indeed. So I love people already starting to show. One of my next one is always, how did you do? And so Anita got 3 out of 10, but she says so many women to look into.
Good. And they're all in our book. Every one of these women, even the ones that were not the right answers, most of those women are also in our book, The Hellraisers and Trailblazers, The Real Women of the Wild West, which you can get it on Amazon or you can get it through True West Magazine, either place. Changing Hands had it, but I think they're out. I think they've sold out.
Okay. I was going to say, I bet Changing Hands has it, but okay, if they sold out, so
we got to resupply those guys.
Indeed. So, Jana, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your passion for so many of these women.
Well, thank you for having me, Marshall. I mean, I hope that I hope it sparks you too, because you're so good at gathering all of these wonderful, weird little facts and inside pieces of information that bring history so alive. You've done such a fabulous job to do this for all of us that I'm glad to contribute a tiny bit to you.
Thank you so much, and have a great rest of your night.
I will, dear. You too.
Thanks. Good night.
Okay. Good night.
Oh my gosh, that was so much fun. And again, and so many amazing women now to look up. And so now you always see, and I know, and I think Anita said at the very beginning at the top of the show that she's already shared it. So this is why you'll want to share, just because we get to have a chance to have so much fun with our history. And so next up, we have From the Vault. So, okay, so if you're down in the old warehouse district, just south of where they play baseball, where they play basketball, there is a new development called, and so it's this apartment complex that basically right in the middle of it has these two historic buildings. And so this is Gerardo's building, dates from the 20s. And Gerardo, he was kind of an entrepreneur. And so he had a barber shop in there at one point. It was an auto shop, did all kinds of things. And then it's like, in the mid-30s, he opened up a cafe. Now, what's unique about these buildings is the fact that it's like it was just south of the railroad tracks. And so there was a small community of Hispanics that lived and worked right there. So he opened up El Café Sorencia. And so I think it's so cool that they're getting ready to, they're prepping that space. They're keeping that building as well as the old grocery next door. But what's really cool is this is, they're basically reviving this to be another restaurant. So they don't know what it's going to be yet. I mean, I would definitely lobby that they keep the name of the historic restaurant that's there just to keep the history of it alive. But one of the things I love is that if you take a look at this building, you'll see it's definitely a two-story building. And so the top story, which actually you get this really great kind of 360 view, would have been living quarters. So there would have been renters up there that probably worked the railroad that also were eating downstairs that were right there. And so I think it's so cool that with all the building that's going on, that folks are realizing our history and incorporating it into adaptive reuse of revitalizing these spaces for the community, which I think is really kind of amazing. That people keep saying, oh, you know, those buildings don't really have anything, but indeed they do. They've got just a great bit of history to share with us. And oh my gosh. And so next week, next Thursday, you'll definitely want to check in because we have Kevin from the Lowell Observatory, and it's going to be so much fun. Oh my gosh. I mean, the stories he's got about Lowell and space exploration all up in northern Arizona, so much fun. So you definitely will want to check out that show. Now, remember, you can check these out on either every Thursday night. You can also track them down on YouTube, and I think I've got a couple up on Spotify. And so every week I'm going to be putting a couple more up there so you can listen to them on your drive to work, maybe doing the dishes. I know that's when I do my podcast listening, is when I'm doing the dishes. Makes that a little less dreadful of a job. All right. So again, thank you all so much. And if you have any stories or folks that maybe I should include, please share. I mean, I love to hear from you all. And so I always want to give a shout out to Chris and Cole, who did that great video at the intro, as well as PJ, my cocktail advisor, for always giving me something delicious. And so here you go, a toast to you all. And leaving, we are going to I'm going to show a little bit about a woman we didn't talk about, but she was Miss America and Miss Arizona, Miss Vonda K. Van Dyke.
I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll compromise. What do you mean? Well, we'll sing a duet. You think you can do that? Look, I mean, you sing a line, and then I'll sing a line. I didn't mean that we both sang together. Yeah, I didn't think you were that good. All right, look, remember, wherever we go and whatever we do, we're going to have to go through it together.